Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound and in a good mood as best as it is possible these days. I'm Arthurian and today I'm going to talk about Merlin. I think Merlin is immediately the first famous wizard that pops up in our head, unless of course you are a Lord of the Rings fan, like I am. And in that case it's Gandalf, and then Saruman, and then Radagast, and only then Merlin. So, the other day I spoke about the Druids and what we truly know about them. And in that video some of you pointed out Merlin, and rightly so. However, I would really like to conduct today's video towards a different approach, and that is the study of the evolution of the figure of Merlin in medieval literature and how he went to being an accomplished, revered and honored Druid, to become a wizard in Arthurian Legends, becoming a prophet, changing again to demon, and progressively regaining his respectable reputation as times and religious mentalities change. As you well know, the figure of Merlin first appears to us in medieval literature, long after the Iron Age and when the Druids occupied an important position in European Atlantic societies, West Atlantic societies. However, it's important to underline that even though Merlin is a medieval construct, indeed his character draws inspiration from at least 2 or 3 legendary druids, semi-legendary mythological druidic figures, right? Which we shall see further ahead. So, what I'm going to do today is a study on European medieval literature to understand the evolution of Merlin through time. You and I are going to deal with a couple of sources that will help us as the basis of study, so we can better comprehend how Merlin came to be, mostly to debunk the idea that he was a real Iron Age druid. But again, the figure of Merlin isn't totally disassociated from that specific historical past, which is equally important to reflect upon to understand the essence of Merlin. I didn't bring the books for you to see, for obvious reasons. I have nowhere to put them, but you can check them at the bibliography by the end of this video, and also throughout this video, because I brought my notebook and certain parts I shall quote for a better understanding. Now, enough of that, let's get started, my dear friends, please. The Arthurian cycle is undoubtedly part of the collective imagination of the European Middle Ages, and it can be said that the stories about the fearless knights of the Round Table are part of a cultural heritage, with King Arthur possibly being the best known figure of this period, except perhaps Robin Hood, another mythical English hero in this case. Well, in addition to the knights, names such as Gawain, Galahad, Percival and Lancelot stand out obviously, and of course the role played by the sorcerer or wizard and prophet Merlin should be highlighted as well. Merlin has an early central role in Arthurian legends, as it is he who, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, in Historia Regum Britanni, dating from 1136, that provides the birth of Arthur by giving Uther, Pendragon, through magical arts, of course, the opportunity to lie down with Igraine, wife of the Duke of Cornwall. From this union will be born the predestined king of past and future, the one who will unite all the peoples of Great Britain, bringing peace to the territory. Merlin is thus arguably as popular as the knights already mentioned before. However, as Arthurian narratives have been progressively Christianized, his role and his powers have been increasingly limited. Thus, when in 1470 Thomas Malory writes Les Morts d'Arthur, Merlin is imprisoned by his apprentice Nynaeve shortly after Arthur is declared king and thus distanced from history. Considering that Geoffrey of Monmouth, Robert de Boron, among others, dedicate entire works to Merlin, the question is why? And why is Merlin a prominent figure in the matter of Great Britain's history and myths and removed from the narrative shortly after Arthur came to the throne? Although It is not my ambition to fully outline the development of this character from its mythological sources to the end of the Middle Ages. I intend at the very least to try to understand, in general terms of course, what its origins are and why Merlin is identified by Geoffrey of Monmouth as son of a spirit, half man, half angel, a tradition followed by other medieval authors who will add more details to the story. With this objective in mind, in a few words, I will start by looking at the importance of magic and the imaginary or the imagination on the fantastical of the Middle Ages, as well as their presence in romance as a literary genre. Next, I will focus on the figure of Merlin. In this sense, we will start by paying special attention to the prophets Myrddin and Lailoken, the most likely sources of inspiration for the author of Vita Merlini, written by Geoffrey of Monmouth. I also think that the importance of Monmouth's work for the development of Merlin and matters related to the history of Brittany must also be considered. Finally, let's look at Robert de Boron's Merlin and the Grail and Thomas Malory, Les Morts d'Arthur. So, these are the main sources we shall take into consideration, and we shall see more as we go. But these are indeed the main ones. So let us start with a brief idea of the evolution of magic and the supernatural throughout the Middle Ages. That's something I think it is important to take in mind so we may understand the development of Merlin and other figures associated with magic, and how the conceptions of magic not only have changed and magic itself became increasingly unacceptable and even forbidden and an abomination, but also the very understanding of magic changed literary figures at the same pace as the understanding of magic itself also changed. And this is crucial to take in mind, as Merlin was without a doubt associated with magic. Therefore, in literature, his entire character also changes due to his associations with magic, precisely. Throughout the European Middle Ages, the supernatural was an integral part still of everyday life, being present throughout the landscape, from forests to lakes or fountains, landscapes and places in the natural world that have a great focus on the religious awareness of the supernatural that ended up giving rise to the great literary romanticisms that usually evoke these landscapes, especially of forests and lakes, as an involving scenario of the stories that relate myths and legends of pre-Christian pagan imagery, finally giving rise to nature-focused romanticisms. In fact, although there was always a growing pressure from the part of the Christian Church to abandon pagan practices, in many rural areas the worship of natural elements such as, let's say, trees and rivers continued. In relation to the study of medieval mentalities, I think it's safe to say that the supernatural in the West can be divided into three spheres. They are mirabilis, magicos and miraculosos, roughly translating the marvelous, the magic and miraculous. Mirabilis designates the wonderful or the marvelous of the pre-Christian past, pagan past, still somewhat preserved in the collective mentality or memory and in art of the Middle Ages, which would include the worship of nature and or pagan places considered sacred. And this would still have a tremendous impact on several medieval works of literature. While magicos refers to magic, of course, namely the demonic supernatural in this case of the Middle Ages, which was a very heavy and recurrent theme throughout the Middle Ages. It bears a great weight on the construction of the supernatural of that period. And finally, the miraculosos, which alludes to the wonderful Christian, to miracles, that is, events that are attributed to the Christian God and that as such do not obey nature or the pagan past. So basically, mirabilis, it is our marvelous with its pre-Christian origins, pagan origins. Magicos, it is known that the term itself could be neutral, understood as neutral in the medieval West at least, as theoretically it was recognized the existence of black magic that had to do with the devil in this period, but also of white magic, which in contrast was considered lithic, as something stronger, natural, and belonging to the earth, and something more scientific, right? In fact, the term magikos and the field which is designated by it quickly slipped over to the side of evil, into the side of Satan. It is therefore the malefic supernatural, the satanic supernatural. Finally, we have the Christian supernatural, what could justifiably be called the wonderful Christian, which is what precedes the miraculous. Miraculous here as something that detaches itself from pagan magic, in the medieval mentality being the true form of magic, the only thing that can actually have a beneficial outcome, as magikos, magic progressively becomes associated with the devil. It also starts to be considered a trickery, a deceit, a pagan illusion, and so the miraculous, the miracles, becomes the only acceptable form of supernatural phenomenon, as it is considered to come directly from the power of God, unlike the magic of the pagans that began to be considered a trick of the devil, understood like this in this period, medieval period. So, this set of ideas compose the structure of the medieval imagination towards the supernatural, and therefore are the, let's say, key ingredients we see behind the construction of medieval literature in relation to the supernatural and the fantastical and the magical. So, the magical arts, which were also very present in the daily life of the medieval population, began by being considered neutral, that is, neither good nor bad, believing that magic could be learned or even taught from books or from studying with a great master sorcerer like Merlin, precisely. Actually, this reminds me that in King Arthur's Enchantress by the author Caroline Larrington, she even states that literacy was a prerequisite for the acquisition of magical knowledge. And I quote, just a short quote, "Literacy is an essential prerequisite for the acquisition of magic." According to Isidore of Seville in Etymologiae Sive Originum, dating from 1472, there are three categories of magic, which are divination, which includes knowledge of the future, the past, and actions or events that occur elsewhere; the spell, performed through the use of words; and finally the use of magical objects. However, these three forms were generally reduced to two: white magic and black magic. And so it is constructed a dualism of magic to accompany the religious mentality of the time that progressively comes ever closer to a battle between good and evil, God versus Satan. Therefore, this is also reflected on the perception of magic, that one is good and another is evil, one is white magic and the other is black magic, respectively. It is also important to mention that the rediscovery of Aristotle's writings in the 12th and the 13th centuries of the Common Era led to the development of the belief that everything in nature had inherent properties, with objects being, among others, hot or cold, wet or dry, so on and so forth. Anyone who was aware of these attributes could create wonderful effects that seemed supernatural, but that actually resulted from the study and manipulation of the hidden laws of the natural world. This magic, entitled natural magic and closest to science, was considered beneficial, being linked to the healing arts and divination. By contrast, black magic, also dubbed necromancy, was understood as a corruption of divine order, a religion that turned people away from God and approached the devil in an attempt to control people and objects, although necromancy was the main magical art within the clergy later on during the late Middle Ages and the modern period. Necromancy is therefore considered in this period heretical and is related to the invocation of demons, a tradition with its origins in Clavicola Solomanes, responsible for performing spells, right? It is also believed that certain stones, plants and animals, as well as knowledge of the true names of evil spirits or demons in general, bestowed dominion over them. In fact, although magic can be used for good or evil by both men and women or all genders, from the late 14th and the early 15th centuries onwards, people began to believe that every act of magic was the result of a pact with the devil. This idea was mainly promoted by the church and by, obviously, proclaimed demonologists, notably Heinrich Riemer and Jakob Schreiner, both German inquisitors responsible for compiling and writing one of the most famous manuals for witch hunting, the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486, which denied the presence of magic without a demonic agreement. You see, Maleficium, which originally was the simple act of sorcery, did not involve the notion of a diabolical pact originally. The idea of a diabolical pact, this idea was attached to it during the latter part of the 14th and the early part of the 15th centuries. So it is here that witchcraft or sorcery, the simple act of performing magic, started to have a whole new turn. Magic, therefore, was believed to operate with the pact. There was no magic without a previous bargain and a pact with the devil. Therefore, everyone doing magic had certainly done a pact with the devil. And this changed everything concerning the perception of magic and witchcraft and those who performed it. This is something I have spoken previously on another video concerning the pact with the devil, precisely where I have delved into this subject in more detail, so no point in repeating myself. The covenant or the pact required to perform magical acts therefore involved a promise between human and devil. The human person promised obedience and denied the divine sacraments, while the devil granted the person supernatural powers and abilities. For such a gift, the gift of doing magic, the devil still demanded to be worshipped as God, which in turn led to the belief that the existence of in the existence of a satanic religion created by him, by the devil, and his followers to lead the Christian people to ruin. Interestingly, although both female and male genders can practice magic, women were the most linked to the forces of the occult, becoming a threat to the established male power and leading to the development of the stereotype of the witch, whose figure is or was believed to be outside the traditional social sphere. She lives usually on the edge of the forest and represents evil itself. The association between magic and the figure of the woman or the feminine is usually very negative in this period, and it was common to believe that wives, sisters and even daughters could use spells against their own family. And it was also believed that most sorceresses belong to a higher class. They have a formal education, can read, write, and are linked to important lineages, which places them on a level of some equality with men. Take the example of Morgan Le Fay in the Arthurian cycle. Furthermore, there was also the belief that spellcasting had, of course, a high price for practitioners, as it made them old more quickly than what was considered natural. An idea also associated with the conviction that outer beauty is a reflection of inner beauty. Thus, in novels, the good ones, the good characters are often always young and beautiful, and the bad ones hideous and decrepit. In the case of Merlin, although his beauty is not the target of great attention by most medieval authors, it is noteworthy that he is described by Robert du Boron as very hairy, a characteristic apparently inherited from his father, and physically older than in reality he really was. And I quote, "And so he was born. When the women took him in their arms, they were frightened, because he was hairier than all the children they had seen. The women who were with his mother often repeated that they greatly marveled for this boy being so hairy and looking older." Also, Morgan Le Fay, who appears in the Life of Merlin, dating to the 1150 by Geoffrey of Monmouth, as a beautiful woman endowed with extraordinary powers and mistress of the island of Avalon. However, in the French tradition later on of the late 13th century, due to the usage of magic, she is no longer desirable as a woman. Surprisingly, female magic is also associated with a certain eroticism, with several tales, for example in Sir Thomas Malory, Les Morts d'Arthur, where knights are imprisoned by sexually heightened witches who wish to unite sexually, of course, with them, whether they agree or not. An example of this is Lancelot, who on different occasions is held prisoner by Morgan Le Fay, who wishes to join with him sexually. Now, considering how the supernatural, the marvelous, the fantastical imagery and the magical arts were part of the medieval daily life, it is not surprising that magic is an essential element in romance as a literary style, particularly visible in Arthurian romances that have passed on to us some of the best known wizards and witches of all times. Take the example of Merlin and Morgan Le Fay once again. King Arthur himself also is associated with magic from the moment of his very conception, provided by a spell manifested by Merlin, and and after the end of his reign, since to heal his wounds, the monarch is taken to Avalon, the land, or the island in this case of apples, land of bliss, where there is no hunger, no disease and no death. Courtly literature, which includes Arthurian romances, will include marvelous and fantastical elements, as there is a desire on the part of the chivalry to create a different culture, of course not opposed to the ecclesiastical one, which was more linked to the aristocracy, but one that best suited its nature, the nature of chivalry. To this end, the authors of this literary genre will make use of an already existing cultural stock, the oral culture, where the presence of the marvelous and the use of magic are significant elements. However, as Geraldine Hank tells us in the article Enchanted Ground, even in romance, magic is not always viewed positively, because being an independent force whose power exceeds that of weapons, it is also something to be feared. And I quote, why not? Magic is an independent force and requires little concession from the human counters with which it transacts. Its dispositions therefore lodge formidable sources of power in the text, to far exceed the mechanism of arms. And because its operations are secret or indecipherable, and may press even the unwilling into service, it is a thing to be feared, particularly by a warrior ethic, for its mysterious compulsions. The practitioners of magic, however, have privileged place in romance, and their influence is often crucial to the unfolding of the adventures. In fact, fantasy and the use of magic seem to be characteristic of Arthurian romances, as well as the idealization of a past period that seeks to appeal to the reader's more affectionate side with a strong sense of nostalgia. Perhaps for this reason, it is common for romance to have a golden age portrayed as the background of the story, creating, to a certain extent, the atmosphere of a fairy tale. Romance is the literary form that comes closest to dreaming, as Northern Fry states, one of the sources I have used. He says that romance is the nearest of all literary forms to the wish fulfillment dream. Very poetic. And for that reason, it had a socially paradoxical role. It seems that in every age, the ruling social class tends to project its ideals in some form of romance, where the virtuous heroes and the beautiful heroines represent the ideals, and the villains, the threats to their ascendancy. The romance has also come to be articulated with folk tales, as both greatly use the court as the space where the narrative will unfold. The fairy tale atmosphere becomes therefore indispensable for the courtly romance that not only intends to describe the environment lived in the feudal European society, but above all to express its ideals. Due to the importance of magic and the supernatural in general in the everyday life of the European Middle Ages, as we have seen before, as well as their relevance in romance and in the Arthurian romances in particular, it is evident that those with the ability and knowledge to cast spells are, without a doubt, fundamental characters in the narrative, and may even be responsible for the beginning of the action. For example, in the English poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight by an anonymous author, it is only after the arrival of the supernatural Green Knight at Arthur's court that Gawain's adventures begin. So, based on this assumption, we will now focus this study on Merlin, the most famous prophet, sorcerer, wizard, and druid, perhaps. Referring to Merlin in the Oxford Guide to Arthurian Literature and Legend, Alan Lupeck begins by recalling the importance of the character whose presence extends from the oldest chronicles to Arthurian romances from the 15th century to the 21st century, a period nowadays where he still holds in television series, movies, comics and numerous books a prominent place. And I quote, please. Like Gawain, Merlin is integral to both the novel and chronicle traditions. He is a figure who appears often in popular culture, though sometimes thought of as Merlin the magician. In various works he is a prophet, a bard, an advisor, a soldier, and a lover, as well as a wizard. So, having played a number of roles, as Lupeck tells us, and rightly so, as you could read on the screen, I hope I won't forget to put it. Well, the magician seems, however, to have two main functions. On the one hand, to ensure the prosperity of the kingdom, and on the other hand, to help the king and members of the court to fulfill their desires. The first to attribute these positions to the wizard Merlin was Geoffrey of Monmouth in the work Historia Regum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Brittany. This seems to be something consistent in the figure of Merlin. Merlin's primary purpose in most versions of the Arthurian Legends, or the Arthurian legend, is to ensure the improvement, evolution of the country, whichever background is being expressed in several versions, and also to assist the king or the person who comes to replace the king, but clearly to assist the person in the position of power whose role, through the guidance of Merlin, will ensure a brighter future in the country. And so Merlin also assists the members of the court in achieving their destinies. Of course, so a figure always linked to prophecy and fulfillment of prophecy. That's the point. So Merlin first performs these tasks in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, circa 1136 to 1138, where he aids a succession of British kings, including the uncle and father of a future King Arthur. Geoffrey of Monmouth, one of the first authors to write extensively about the legendary King Arthur, combines a number of elements that in turn will influence many of the later Arthurian texts. Right? One of the author's sources is the chronicle Historia Brittonum, written by the Welsh monk Ninnius, circa 849 to 850 of the Common Era, obviously, where Arthur is mentioned not as a king but as a dux bellorum, a military chief or a battle leader in this case. It should be noted that in relation to this chronicle, the manuscripts are anonymous, and there are currently several critics and authors who have questioned the authorship of Ninnius, and hence some refer to the author of Historia Brittonum as pseudo-Ninnius. Just a side note. In this manuscript, the name of Merlin is not mentioned, but instead that of a young prophet, Ambrosius Aurelianus, a figure believed to have been used by Monmouth as an inspiration for the character Merlin. However, while it is clear that Geoffrey of Monmouth will draw inspiration from several earlier traditions, he will also innovate and add new elements, of course, being the one who, for example, establishes Arthur's family tree, never done before, making him the son of Uther, Pendragon and Dame Igraine, and brother to Anna or Anne, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, Arthur would have only one sister, Anna or Anne, married to King Lut and mother of to Gawain or Wolgan and Mordred. However, throughout the Middle Ages, the number of Arthur's sisters or half-sisters will increase, so from the 13th century onwards we can distinctively perceive at least 3 half-sisters: Elaine, Morgause and Morgan Le Fay, daughters of Igraine and the Duke of Cornwall. It is also this author, Geoffrey of Monmouth, who will attribute or bestow on Merlin some of the attributes that will be associated with him throughout the Middle Ages, including being the son of an incubus, a male demon. According to Monmouth, Merlin's father was a part man, part angel spirit who inhabited the space between the moon and the earth. And I quote, in case you don't believe me, and of course in case you don't want to spend your time reading the sources, which is perfectly understandable. As Apuleius informs us in his book concerning the demon of Socrates, between the moon and the earth inhabit those spirits which we will call incubuses. These are of nature partly man and partly angels, and whenever they please assume human shapes and lie with women. It is noteworthy to point out that in his first description, Monmouth identifies this being as a spirit, something between the divine and the human, not associating him, contrary to what will happen with later authors, directly to a demon, not yet. Furthermore, Monmouth is even responsible for starting a tradition of prophecies attributed to Merlin. The number of predictions pronounced supposedly by the magician or the wizard were initially part of the work Prophetae Merlini, circa 1135, being later included by the author in Historia Regum Britanniae. However, perhaps because of the difficulty in interpreting such predictions or prophecies, they were not always translated or adapted by other authors. Finally, it remains the importance given to the relationship between King Arthur and Merlin. Today, inseparable figures who, as already mentioned before, I think, occupy a prominent place in the European collective imagination. In fact, the connection between the two seems to invoke that which existed between the Druids and Kings of the, let's say, for a better understanding, the Celtic or Celticized peoples. So let us then look at the possible origins of Merlin. What tradition or traditions is Monmouth based on to create this character? Are we facing a figure of mythological or historical origins? Let's see, please. So let's start by looking at the origins of Myrddin and Lailoken. Merlin, as a character created by Geoffrey of Monmouth, seems to be clearly inspired by the Druids of the Celtic people and Celticized peoples, who held special prestige in the community and performed a series of religious functions, including the sacrifice of people and animals. With a social cultural organization based on a tripartite structure, most Celtic or Celticized peoples were divided, in addition to the king or chieftain, into 3 other distinct social groups: the priestly class, the warrior class, and the producer or provider class. The latter class of the Celts was composed mostly by craftsmen, although it could also be understood of anyone with a special manual or artistic gift. The importance of this group is to be highlighted, as in the Celtic communities, all those who could work iron were praised, and some members may indeed have held titles similar to that of a Druid. The first class included Druids, priests, diviners, healers, bards and poets, being highly hierarchical and with varying degrees of specialization. In Celtic mythology, Druids were considered protectors of tradition, educators of young people, and even apparently guardians of writing systems. Historically speaking, there are no concrete evidences of a written form of a clear Celtic origin, even though Ogham is usually mentioned as the Celtic written form, but having appeared in Ireland long after the Druids were gone and as a written form derived from the Latin script. But at least we can consider them as indeed protectors of the traditions, educators of the young, and at the very least guardians of the sacred word in oral form, at least, transmission of knowledge in oral tradition. The Druids also presided over religious life and participation in justice as well, or indeed passing on justice, involved in matters of law of their societies. They were soothsayers as well and magicians, and they performed human and animal sacrifice in magical religious performances. So they presided over a variety of spheres, and undoubtedly this helped to reinforce their authority, making them at least equal to the king or the chieftain or a figure of high authority among Celtic societies or Celticized peoples. And curiously, Druids seem to also have willed the power of life and death, so no doubt even kings would see Druids as figures of authority and great power. Celtic communities did not use a written form to record their history, as I said. Indeed, the Druids forbade writing, in particular of aspects related to religion, as it was up to them to keep the oral tradition alive. So, representatives of the gods, their power was even greater than that of kings, and they were not bound by any contract. That is, if a Druid wanted, the Druid could abandon a monarch and serve another more generous or influential. I must say that in several Celtic tribes, the king usually came from the warrior class and was responsible for enforcing the laws adopted in assembly, his power being limited by a series of gesa, or prohibitions of a magical and religious nature. The infringement of these gesa could lead to misfortune and even death. So let's borrow an anglicized term from the Polynesian languages. My apologies, it's just for a better understanding, which is taboo, right? The king had such a tremendous authority and regarded as being very powerful that their own power had imposed limitations. It was also the responsibility of the monarch or the king to ensure the well-being of the kingdom, such as distributing wealth, as the prosperity of the land depended on his physical and mental health. Hence, some monarchs, especially in the late Bronze Age and during the Iron Age, at least in Ireland, have been sacrificed in times of famine and in times of need or a clear decline of the society in which they lived or ruled. The monarch's sacrifice provided an offering with the purpose of restoring balance and prosperity, especially in terms of fertility, providing fertility with his sacrifice. Furthermore, a Druid, as someone responsible for the spiritual power, and kings, holders of temporal power, constituted two halves of the same coin, whose association was crucial for the prosperity of a tribe or community or society. Likewise, the connection between Arthur and Merlin is fundamental to establish peace in the territory and start a golden age. And it is only when the two come together that the period of harmony and richness begins. This is due to the mystical character of Arthur's coming. He is the predestined king, the one who will succeed where others have failed. Now, Merlin, as a prophet, knows that only Uther's son will be able to bring order, and hence he is, in a way, the matrix force behind the beginning of Arthur's reign, like a Druid. Indeed, in many works concerning Britain's history and religion and mythology as well, Merlin, in addition to being endowed with supernatural powers, is also able to predict the future. A characteristic he seems to have inherited from two particular figures. They are Myrddin and Lailoken, finally. The oldest reference to Myrddin appears in the poem Harnes Preden, the prophecy of Britain, which comprises of Luther, Taliesin, the book of Taliesin, dating back to the 10th century. This manuscript contains 12 other poems that are believed to have been written by Taliesin himself, considered the greatest bard of Wales. Although it is associated with aspects of the marvelous and the fantastic and the magical, it is believed that Taliesin lived in the 6th century with two distinct versions of his life. In Luther, Taliesin, he is said to have been born in the north, in the lowlands of Scotland, being in the service of Urien and Owain. In the book Hans Taliesin, a 16th century manuscript, much later, it is said that Taliesin was born in the south, in Powys, and that he was immortal. The relationship between Myrddin and Taliesin is a common motif in medieval Welsh literature, as the poem and I'm not going to try to pronounce that one, don't worry, I'll put it on the screen for you to read. Well, this poem, translated as the conversion of Myrddin and Taliesin, demonstrates this strong and important relationship between these two. Furthermore, also in the Welsh Triads, another title that goes into the screen, the names of Myrddin and Taliesin are invoked as two of the three most talented bards at Arthur's court. In the poem Harnes Preden, which has come to be dated to the 10th century, as said before, Myrddin is identified as a prophet. Myrddin's name later appears again in the Black Book of Carmarthen, circa 1250, written entirely in Welsh and including the poems, the apple trees, the little pig stanzas, and, this is a tough one, the conversion of Myrddin and Taliesin. Right. The poem, the apple trees, contains prophecies made by Myrddin and makes a reference to the Battle of Arthurith, where Gwendolen was defeated and killed by Rutherf. I'm going to have a seizure if I continue to try to pronounce these ones. Anyway, according to the poem, Gwendolen was lord of Myrddin, and hence, after his death, he went mad, living in exile in the forest. Pay close attention at that particular point. The Battle of Arthurith, considered an historical event, is mentioned in Annales Cambriae, the Annals of Wales, in the year 573 of the Common Era, where it is stated that the battle was between the sons of Aelfir and Gwendolen, and I quote, "The battle of Arthurith between the sons of Aelfir and Gwendolen, son of Caio, in which battle Gwendolen fell, Merlin went mad." And this is from the Annals Cambriae 447 and 954. So the Annals of Wales covers a period from 447 to 954 of the Common Era and reports events that took place not only in Wales but also in Ireland, Cornwall, England and Scotland. In addition to these poems, there's also what I shall place on the screen, translated as the dialogue of Myrddin and his sister Gwendith, dated from the 14th century, in which not only alludes again to a series of prophecies and the death of Gwendolen, but it also suggests that Myrddin is a poet and a warrior. Besides these poems, there are two in which Myrddin also appears, and they are, please look at the screen or follow the subtitles, another tough one, the diffused song of Myrddin in the grave and Commanding Youth, both from the 14th century. Yes, I got it right. Stories similar to Myrddin still exist in Scottish and Irish traditions. See, for example, the work Buile Sivina, the madness of Sivina, or Sivina's frenzy. Buile Sivina is the story of Buile, of Sivina, sorry, sometimes anglicised as Sweeney or Sweeney, a legendary king of Ulster, Ireland, who is cursed after killing a psalmist and goes mad. Told in a mixture of poetry and prose, the story is believed to date originally from the 10th century, yet it exists only in a 17th century manuscript, circa 1671. Still, it seems that there is a strong connection between Myrddin and Lailoken, as we shall see, the Lailoken, the wild Scotsman who lives in the forest and also has the gift of prophecy. Lailoken appears in two stories, Cantigern and Lailoken and Maldred and Lailoken, preserved in the life of Saint Cantigern, in the British manuscript known as Cotton Titus A, 19th of the 15th century. The first narrative, Kentigern and Lailoken, relates an encounter between Saint Kentigern, I will put on the screen in Welsh, and in Latin is Kentigernus, better known as Saint Mungo. Well, in the source relates to an encounter between Saint Kentigern and Lailoken, during which the latter, Lailoken, is even identified as Merlin. Lailoken asks Saint Kentigern to give him the Eucharist and the last rites, as he knows he will die soon, having, by the way, predicted that he will suffer 3 different deaths: by stoning, by a wooden spear, and by drowning, all of which have proven to be true, as Lailoken is stoned and beaten by shepherds, falls on a spear into a lake, and dies with his head underwater. The main motif present in Kentigern and Lailoken is the triple death of Lailoken, which is taken up again in Myrddin and Lailoken, where the death of the prophet occurs after he denounced adultery of King Myrddin's wife. We can then understand that in these two figures, Myrddin and Lailoken, there are at least 2 analogous features. First, both are prophets, and second, both go mad, although it is not clear why Lailoken loses his mind, but both go mad and go on to live in exile in the forest, and pay close attention at that. Now, given the work The Life of Merlin, which is much closer to Welsh traditions and where Merlin holds the main role, it is worth noting a set of elements that seem to us, without a doubt, similar to the narratives about Myrddin and Lailoken. First, right at the beginning of the text, the author narrates how, after a battle between the armies of Peredur, Prince of North Wales, and Gwendolen, monarch of the Kingdom of Scotland, Merlin went mad and self-exiled, living in the forest as a wild animal. According to Monmouth, Geoffrey of Monmouth, Merlin's madness is instigated by the enormous sadness felt when witnessing the death of 3 princes, brothers of Peredur, so much so that even though they are victorious, the words of his allies are of no comfort to him, and he leaves and moves away by himself. And I quote, "Peredur and the other princes and commanders offered comfort. He, Merlin, would not take their comfort and rejected their entreaties. So for 3 long days he wept, refusing food, so great the grief that consumed him. Then the air was full with these repeated loud complaints. A strange madness came upon him. He crept away and fled to the woods, unwilling that any should see his going. Into the forest he went, glad to lie hidden beneath the ash tree." So after a period during which Merlin lives like a wild animal, like a wild thing, as Monmouth states, he finally regains consciousness when he hears a song of mourning for all those he had left behind, thus returning to civilization. Nevertheless, the prophet is quickly tired of living at court, or at the court of his sister Genade's husband, Gwendith, right? The court of King Rhydderch, and yearns to set out again for the forest. It is, however, while Merlin lives at the court, that we are faced with the prophecy of the triple death again. After Merlin reveals his sister's adultery, Genada tries to discredit his claims, asking a young man to disguise himself 3 times and ask the prophet to predict his death. Merlin then predicts 3 different deaths for the same person: by a fall from a great height, a violent death involving a tree, and finally a river. By making such predictions, Merlin's accusations of infidelity are ignored, and he ends up leaving the court. Years later, the prediction becomes true, however, as the young man dies when he falls off a cliff into a tree, where he gets 1 foot stuck and the rest of his body plunged into a river, and I quote again. "While hunting with a pack of dogs, the youth saw a stag hiding in the forest undergrowth. The young man pressed on and took a straight course over the mountain, looking for a stag among the scattered rocks. But in his headlong course, his horse happened to slip and went over a high precipice, and its rider plunged down the steep cliff slope into the river. But he fell in such a way that one foot caught in a tree, and the rest of the body was submerged in the flowing stream. So then he fell, he was drowned, he hung from a tree, and by his triple death he proved the prophet, a true one. Although with obvious changes, Merlin's prediction of the young man's triple death is very close to Lailoken's premonition of his own demise in Kentigern and Lailoken, the source Kentigern and Lailoken we have seen previously. Furthermore, the revelation of the queen's adultery, who in this case is also the prophet's sister, finds a parallel in the narrative Myrddin and Lailoken, in which, as we have seen, Lailoken dies after denouncing the infidelity of Myrddin's wife. It is also to be noted that Lailoken is described as a very hairy man, a characteristic that in the work Merlin and the Grail will be maintained by Robert de Boron, but later on. Naturally, this detail could be a mere chance, and there is no evidence that can indicate whether Boron was aware of the Lailoken prophecies or not. However, the fact of their exile and living like animals or wild things in the forest perhaps is linked to the idea of these figures being quite hairy. Thus, the development of Merlin, prophet and sorcerer, from Celtic myths to the writings of Geoffrey of Monmouth seems to be linked to a series of legends and motifs that intertwine due to the identification of the Scottish wild man and prophet Lailoken with the divine Myrddin in Wales, and also to the latter's connection with the famous Welsh bard Taliesin. So, we have various stages of the Merlin character's evolution. The stages in the development of the Merlin figure from Celtic myth and poetry to Geoffrey of Monmouth's writings, which present basic themes such as that of the wild man, which are linked to the battle of Arthurian and to Lailoken and to Saint Kentigern, and then the legend is transferred from the north of Britain to Wales, and Lailoken is identified with Myrddin. Subsequently, the legend is developed in Wales and is associated with the national tradition of prophecy. And finally, Geoffrey of Monmouth transforms Myrddin into the Merlin figure who plays a role in international literature. Finally, in order to better understand the evolution of Merlin from the 12th and the 13th centuries onwards, let us now look more closely at two medieval works. They are Merlin and the Grail by Robert de Boron and Les Morts d'Arthur by Thomas Malory. So we are getting close to the end, finally. Now, following the chronicle order, let's start with the work Merlin and the Grail. Dating back to the late 12th and early 13th centuries, this is part of a cycle of romances written by Robert de Boron, and is one of the most outstanding works on the cultural matter of Britain, having to a large extent influenced the Vulgate cycle and post-Vulgate cycle. Produced between 1215 and 1235, the Vulgate cycle integrates 5 romances: Histoire de Merlin, Histoire des Sangs Graal, Lancelot l'Empereur, Morts d'Arthur, Quest del Sang Graal. The post-Vulgate cycle, one of the major old French prose cycles of the Arthurian literature from the early 13th century, written between the 1230 and 1240, includes Merlin, Histoire des Sangs Graal, written from Histoire des Sangs Graal by the Vulgate cycle and the prose adaptation of Robert de Boron's Histoire du Graal, and Quest des Sangs Graal, another adaptation of Quest and also of the Morts d'Arthur of the Vulgate cycle. Now, Merlin and the Grail is the second volume written by Robert de Boron. The first volume written by Boron, entitled Joseph d'Artemantie, is dedicated to the history of the Holy Grail, and it was this author who transformed the mysterious Grail described by Crétin de Troyes in work Perceval, the Tale of the Grail, Perceval or le Conte du Graal, circa 1182, and made it the Holy Grail, thus mixing the stories of the Arthurian Grail with the Holy Grail used by Jesus Christ at the Last Supper. Hubert de Boron's third work on the history of the Holy Grail survives only in small fragments in the work entitled Didu Perceval, narrating the adventures of the Knight of the Round Table of the same name, Perceval, and how he manages to reach the Grail, taking the place of the Fisher King. After Perceval's victory, the novel focuses on Arthur and the end of his reign. Now, as stated before, Merlin and the Grail is the second volume written by Hubert de Boron that will incorporate the birth of the sorcerer into the story of the Holy Grail. However, although the French author seems to have been partly influenced by the life of Merlin, Vita Merlini, by Geoffrey of Monmouth, spoken before, in this version Merlin is a being of diabolic origin. Indeed, the sorcerer's birth results from an assembly of demons who, angry by the good deeds done by the Son of God on earth, decide to conceive a child, an Antichrist, who would help them to deceive humankind. And to do this, they choose a woman, first destroying her family, so that she succumbs to the devil's desires and turns away from God. When this does not happen, for behold, the woman was a devout Christian, they provoke her anger until she forgets the teachings of the master confessor, being outside his protection and then at the mercy of an incubus, a devil now with a male form. According to Boron, and I quote here, please, that demon who had the power, assuming a human figure, to sleep with a woman, was ready. He came, he slept with her, and she conceived. Thus, by these evil arts and with preserved purposes, Merlin is conceived. Similar to what is described by the French author, the prophet's mother was found sleeping while the incubus, the inhuman form but with two prominent horns, inseminates her. However, before the child is born, God gives him the ability to decide whether his path would be good or evil. Let us see what Boron tells of this, please. God didn't want the devil to lose the knowledge of what should happen, and he wanted him to have what he wanted. That's why he created him. He created him so that he had the art of knowing the things that existed, the things said and done and happened, and all this he knew. He then gave him the power and intelligence to know the things that should happen. For these reasons, the boy had the knowledge of things done, said, and happened, because he got it from the enemy. And besides knowing the things that are about to happen, our Lord wanted him to know, in relation to other things, what he knew for himself. I can't understand my own writing. Anyway, in this way, the powers of Merlin, once wonderful in origin and are now of divine source, as you could see. It is God who put in that body the spirit to see, hear and understand everything, according to Boron. A change that reflects the growing Christianization of themes and motifs linked to Arthurian legends. So, from the 12th century onwards, an attempt was made to adapt more and more the narratives on the matter of the cultures of Britain to the new ideas of a moral and spiritual nature promoted by the Church. In this way, some characters hitherto central to Arthurian legends, because they behaved differently from the new demands of a moral order, Christian order, or because they were rooted in pagan gods or heroes, came to embody the vices of the court of Camelot. As an example of this is Gawain, who, although in the works of Crétin de Troyes, Lancelot or Le Chevalier de la Charrette, Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, and Perceval or Le Conte du Graal, Perceval and the Story of the Grail, continues to behave courteously otherwise similar to what and how he is in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, will be subject to a process of progressive degradation, right? The Arthurian legends therefore fall more and more into Christianity, though the presence of Merlin with his now new demonic origins, but influenced for good, and through the emphasis on the Grail, Arthurian legend was explicitly situated within a large Christian history. However, although one of the consequences of the introduction of the Grail theme was the improvement of the romance genre and the multiplication of the knight's adventures, it is noteworthy that all these changes had a considerable effect on the representations made on the figure of Merlin, contributing to a new reading of this subject in relation to his character. In fact, due to Merlin's origins, which, as we have seen, remote from the Celtic Druids and the prophets Myrddin and Lailoken, he will gradually start to be removed from the narrative, not only because of his potential as a pagan figure of the past, but also because of his connection on the paternal side to the forces of evil. So, while the supernatural endorses Arthur, the chronicles, like some later romance writers, limit Merlin's role by removing him early on from the narrative, perhaps because there's an uneasiness about this potentially pagan figure who is connected with demons. So this change of mentalities according to the changes on religious morals and perceptions of magic and the supernatural in general start to remove Merlin from the narrative or the narratives early on, but also gives him a less respectable character. However, it must be said that in the work of Robert de Boron, Merlin continues to play a fundamental role, as it is still he who recommends Uther to build a table identical to the one used by Jesus Christ at the Last Supper. This table has 13 seats, one of them being the famous dangerous chair or perilous seat, siège périlleux, intended for the knight who will reach the Holy Grail. In this way, there is the Christianization of another and one of the most crucial elements in Arthurian legends, the Round Table, which appears for the first time in the Roman du Brut, romance circa 1150, yes, by the Norman author and poet Wace. In Wace's work, the table is constructed to avoid internal disputes between Arthur's allies, since being round, everyone would be on an equal footing. Nothing new that. Given this and the progressive Christianization of Arthurian themes and of Britain's cultures and legends, when Thomas Malory wrote Les Morts d'Arthur in the second half of the 15th century, Merlin was already a character whose role in the narrative had been significantly reduced. The sorcerer does not cease to be relevant, of course, however, since he is the one who will be Arthur's tutor, a condition, moreover, imposed by Uther even before the child is born. And I'll put here on the screen what Thomas Malory writes about it. Don't worry. As already mentioned, Merlin will be a crucial figure in the establishment of Arthur's reign, and at least in the beginning he will also be the king's advisor, warning him when his actions are wrong and preventing him from the threat posed by Mordred, son of Arthur, with the wife of King Luth, his half-sister. And please, let's see another quote. Thus, although Malory recognizes Merlin's importance in Arthurian narrative, the author describes the sorcerer as the son of a demon. He was a devil's son, that's how Malory puts it, but omits Robert de Boron's explanation of the intervention of God in the development of his powers. Perhaps for this reason, when he falls in love with young Nynaeve, one of the Lady of the Lake's maidens, and intends to go to bed with her, Merlin's sexual desire is exacerbated, underlying the continuous insistence on the part of the sorcerer. Again, I'll put on the screen exactly what Malory says of this, please. So, due to his demonic origin and after having learned everything he could from Merlin, Nynaeve, afraid of losing her virginity to the wizard, does not hesitate to imprison him in a cave forever, removing him definitely from the narrative. Another quick quote, please. So it seems quite clear that one of the reasons why the sorcerer was progressively removed from Arthurian narratives and clearly an evolution of Merlin towards a more derogatory character to express Christian religious morality is due to his pagan background. For, as we have seen, this is rooted in the prophets Myrddin, who in turn is linked to the Welsh bard Taliesin and Lailoken. Furthermore, in his relationship with King Arthur, Merlin plays a role similar to that of the Druids of the Celticized peoples. And also, not only is the sorcerer conceived by a malevolent supernatural being, an incubi or incubus, but according to Robert de Boron, his birth is part of a diabolical conspiracy that seeks to turn humanity away from God's path. Taking this into consideration, and furthermore, when from the 12th century there is an increasing adaptation of Britain's legendary narratives to the ideals promoted by the Christian Church, it is not surprising that this character begins to be interpreted in a negative perspective. And finally, remember also that in the 14th and the 15th centuries, magic began to be seen as the result of a diabolical pact. In this way, those who could cast spells or perform incantations could only be seen as followers of the devil. Looking again at Robert de Boron's work, we can see that although the author presents a rewriting of the narrative initiated by Geoffrey of Monmouth, the work Merlin and the Grail does not present the sorcerer as a threat to the established order. In fact, according to Boron, Merlin's supernatural powers are not opposed to Christian values, and therefore the sorcerer remains a crucial character not only for the inauguration of Arthur's reign, but also for the eventual search for the Holy Grail, right? So, the final question is, what then makes the Merlin described by Robert de Boron different from that of Malory? It seems to us that the answer lies again in the sorcerer's conception. While Boron emphasizes the importance of God's intervention in Merlin's life, as he gives him part of his gifts, authors such as Malory later on will focus only on the character's demonic paternal lineage, a fact which certainly had a major impact in the way Merlin was seen by the public at that time. However, regardless of the origin, pagan, diabolic or divine, Merlin was, during the Middle Ages and continues to be today, a notable figure in the European imagination, not only for his association with Arthurian legends, but for being considered one of the most famous sorcerers or wizards of all time. Alright, my dear friends, I hope today's video was useful. For more information on this subject, be sure to consult the sources to better make it clear the evolution of the figure of Merlin throughout the Middle Ages. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, thank you for today. Farewell, my dear friends. I can't understand my own writing. Only a little. And to make things even more difficult, I make drawings in the middle of my own writing.